Faithless Hijabi provides a supportive community for young people who have left the faith, along with access to mental health services and resources. But they need your help to continue their important work. Please consider donating to Faithless Hijabi and help make a difference in the lives of these young people. Together, we can provide them with the support they need to heal and thrive.
Well, I think this is a good time to start the next section. But before we do, I'd like to once again encourage our audience to head over to the Faithless Hijabi website to donate, and the link should be listed below. Okay, our next section. Most of us who bring a critique to respective religions have experienced living in the actual consequences of believing in tenets, superstitions, and demands. And it's usually true that when that apostate brings unique angles and perspectives when it comes to criticizing religion, but even that field has challenges, given that there are denominations on top of denominations whom delegitimize each other, sometimes turning the discussion into a really bizarre game of whack-a-mole. Joining us to discuss the role of an apostate in promoting critical thinking and challenging religious orthodoxy are two unique individuals. The first of which is someone who I've followed for some time and have had the pleasure of listening and speaking to in person. Mr. Seth Andrews is a broadcaster, storyteller, author, an activist and public speaker, best known as host of the popular website, podcast, and online community, The Thinking Atheist. Welcome, Seth.
Hey, it's good to be here. Thanks for the invite.
A pleasure. Aleem is an ex-Muslim sharing his story about why he left Islam and helps others to share their respective stories through his social media profiles. Check him out on Instagram through the handles Leaving Islam and Secular Spirit. Well, I'd like to kick this off by asking the both of you a question. And you'd think that an apostate who leaves a faith is in a relatively perfect position to critique aspect of whatever religion they come out of. But I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that there are a few hundred iterations of a general umbrella religion and several hundred more off of each denomination off of that. When you come across people in conversation, I'm sure you've heard the arguments that you haven't experienced the real Christianity, the real Islam, the real, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, being people yourselves who've left religious faith, how have your particular experiences led you to deal with people who take this angle on dismissing your experience with whatever interpretation of the religion you came out of?
I'll defer to Aleem on this one.
Thank you, Seth. And thank you for having me here. I appreciate the invite, and nice to meet you, Bruce and Rada. I don't think I've had the pleasure to meet either of you before. Well, the best way to put it is, in a sense, it's kind of the perfect out to say that to anyone who criticizes your religion. Oh, well, you never really practice it, or your version isn't the true faith. So in a nutshell, what I try to do when I talk about my own experiences is, first of all, to clarify that this is my own subjective experience. But I also try to touch on the universals that, if not every single, if we're just going to talk about Islam, that every single Muslim believes, that most of them believe. So when you talk about those kinds of things, and for example, it would be the idea that there's a loving God who created us all, and that there's a heaven and hell, and that the word of God is the Quran. That's kind of a basis that I would say most Muslims will say is part of their core belief. And then I kind of go from there. So I target the things that are most universal, and I expand from there. And yet some people will still say, obviously, oh, well, your interpretation is wrong, or, well, I don't personally believe this, but you got to start from somewhere.
I'm struck by the protective mechanisms that fundamentalist faiths have. Rather than risk legitimizing somebody who left for legitimate reasons, the whole culture has to kind of shoot the messenger. Well, nobody who truly knew the love of Jesus or Allah or whoever would have ever left their embrace. And that's a way of sort of disqualifying us before we are to be heard. It's a way of sort of washing away any positions, arguments, challenges, questions, doubts, etc., by saying, well, we've discredited the witness. And I think that religions have evolved, for lack of a better way of saying it, a lot of defense mechanisms that brush away criticism. We've certainly seen this with Islam, right? If you and I go after, Islamists, Islamic theocracies, Muhammad, the Quran, whatever, they just scream Islamophobe, which is a way of discrediting the messenger, right? And that way everything else can be brushed away because, well, you don't get it. You were a false prophet. You were never a true Muslim, or you are just getting it all wrong and we shouldn't listen to you, la, 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 la. And there's a lot of that, I think, in the faiths that serve as a protective mechanism against having to field genuine questions, challenges, and criticism.
It really is as simple as for many Muslims, if they were to encounter Seth, if they were to encounter you and what you're saying about Islam, they'll say, well, his name is Seth Andrews. What could he possibly actually know about Islam?
Yeah, a white American ex-Christian. Well,
clearly
why in the world are we
agenda.
listening to that guy about Islam? Yeah, he's wiped me out of the conversation.
You got some sort of white supremacist ulterior motive going on, of course.
Yeah. But you also get this kind of blowback from the more progressive churches as well. This reminds me of something that happened several years ago. A few years back, I had a chance to ask Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins during one of their events about, what did I say? I asked them, like, what makes someone a quote-unquote real Christian, a real Muslim, a Hindu, Buddhist, what have you, because we have so many different interpretations of these beliefs. Now, this is early on in my introduction to New Atheism. So, I didn't really understand the answer that Sam and Richard gave me at the time, but they stated something along the lines of, you don't necessarily need to care about that angle, but what you do need to be aware of is what happens when you follow through to the consequences of believing in certain tenets that come from their beliefs and their text. I mean, it's in the Bible, it's in the Quran, it's in whatever forms the foundations of these faiths, and speaking of these consequences, the most obvious ones I can think of at the moment is like, how should women and homosexuals be treated? When it comes to this weird game of whack-a-mole, when it comes from either critiquing fundamentalism or progressivism and the kind of apologetics that come to the background, is the core of the criticism we should be developing, should we bring to bear the criticism on those fundamentalists' texts, regardless of the interpretation of the faith, whether they're progressive or conservative?
I don't want to walk on Aleem, but I'm going to jump in first.
Go ahead.
There's a larger issue that you speak to, which is the ever-moving goalposts.
Yeah.
So, I condemn slavery in the Old Testament. Well, it wasn't slavery. It was indentured servitude, or it was a different time and God had to condescend to the culture of the era, or it was a mistranslation, or you're using the wrong translation, blah, blah, blah. And it doesn't really matter. It's interesting. I quote the verse in 2 Timothy where God silences women. Well, Paul didn't actually mean that women should be silent, and God loves women. And here's another verse where women are to be honored. And so what happens is the goalposts are just always in motion, where no matter what you say, no matter what challenge you bring, they won't, or at least feel that they won't be pinned down. It's almost like when somebody goes into the hospital and you say, do you believe in the power of prayer? Yes. Do you believe God does miracles? Yes. Do you believe God wants you healed? Yes. Why are you going to the hospital? Why are you paying the premiums? Why are you paying the doctors? Why are you going through the rigor of surgery? Why don't you just pray for healing? Well, it may be healing in the future. God may be using the hands of the surgeon. Maybe it's pain in this life and bliss in the next life. God is using light and momentary affliction to build my faith. Well, it's a fallen world and God wants to help, but he really can't. I mean, it doesn't make any difference. And I know this has got to be true with Islam, where if you throw something out, they're playing dodgeball, right? They'll just step to the left and say, well, no, you got that wrong. And they two-step around it. And I'm fascinated by this stuff.
Well, just kind of add to that. Go ahead, Rada, please.
No. Continue. I'll go ahead and ask my question after.
Sure. I just wanted to add one point to that, is that I think what is usually the case when you see this kind of behavior, it's because if you want to call them fundamentalists or just believers in general, is because they haven't really confronted or addressed these questions before. And I don't even mean to others, but within themselves. I can tell you just like from my own experience. So I spent half of my life as a practicing Muslim. I had all sorts of homophobic beliefs. I was a homophobic person, but I never asked myself the question of why is homosexuality wrong? Like, what is it about it that is wrong and that makes it bad? And it was only after I left that I began asking myself those questions. And so for a lot of these believers, they haven't thought about it. They haven't been asking those questions, those critical questions of why and how. And that's why you get all this nonsense with the shifting of goalposts and rationalizing things, because you're really hitting them at places where they don't really have good answers.
Do Muslims have a working knowledge of the Quran? Because normally what I hear is this sort of parroting of a few catchphrases, but I sense, I mean, I thought Christians didn't know their Bible, but I just get
Nobody
this
really
sense
knows
that
their religion. Seth. That's
really.
the unfortunate truth. Like for my, so I, I'm from Saudi Arabia, so like my language is Arabic, and everybody learned Quran and Hadith and fiqh and all sorts of religious stuff in school. And even with all of that, I mean, I can give you at least from my perspective, and that's not like the majority of Muslims, because the majority of Muslims do not speak Arabic or even know how to speak Arabic. So to them, just like the fundamentalist Christians, when you go and tell them like, well, the Quran says that you should, women have like, half the testimony of men, and well, you can beat women and you can discipline them and you can marry up to 4 and you can marry a prepubescent child, and they'd be like, yes, but they can just imagine that Chad weird like meme was like, yes. And if you go to like the other ones, the apologists would be, I know, I swear to God, they do that. I mean, say God, but whatever. But I mean, if you go to the others, the apologists, they'll be like, oh, there's nuance. And they give you these like insulting apologetics about why women need to be beaten, or like why homosexuals are being killed, or why apostates need to be killed. I wanted to ask a question to both of y'all. And it's more related to, so, there's this saying back in the day, like, don't talk about politics, sex, or religion, that those 3 topics, you'll never agree on anything. So when it comes to people that, live in fundamentalist countries or people that live in religious communities, how would you even suggest or encourage dialogue between those that are religious and those that are non-religious? If you do, how do you say we would do that?
That's a very good question.
So essentially, Aleem, she's asking, how do we fix the world? Okay, God. Well, that's a big one. Go ahead.
Well, I think one of the things I wanted to talk about specifically in the segment was something I discovered. So my background is Palestinian, and something I discovered that exists actually in Palestine and Israel, and you'll find it across the world too, are these workshops that are built on the concept of nonviolent communication. And the basic idea of nonviolent communication is that it gives a platform for people who perhaps have conflicting ideas or are angry at each other, even in that most simplistic form, to share their feelings and their needs in a way that's not blaming the other side, that's not attacking the other side. And I think this is a critical point here too. The point of it isn't to resolve the issues and fix everything, but just get both sides talking and listening to hear each other's perspectives, and then take it from there. And I think that's something that's actually worked in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where people who would never talk to each other before, would never even listen to what the other side has to say, are actually listening to each other. And when it comes to religion, and let's talk about Islam specifically, I think that's a good foundation. When, let's say, I'm an ex-Muslim, you're an ex-Muslim, the other party thinks I'm working for the devil, I'm trying to destroy the world, and that I'm ultimately going to hell. Now, if you can kind of talk without them, you're going to still have that bias, but where they can just like listen and see where you're coming from. I think that's something that's so greatly lacking in our discourse on social media, unfortunately, today, and in day-to-day life as well.
I've been doing a lot of broadcasting lately, speaking to psychologists, experts in the brain and belief. And it's interesting because when somebody is presented with an ideological threat, and religion and politics specifically, these are beliefs linked to our value system. They're linked to our identity. And it has been measured that when people feel that their beliefs are attacked, the same part of the brain, the amygdala, fires up when they feel a physical threat. It's the same mechanism going on. And so the fight or flight scenario kicks in. They're either going to do battle and say, you're wrong, you're doubly wrong, blah, 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 you're of the devil, or they're just going to get out of Dodge. They're just going to leave as quickly as they can. Well, when I first was an apostate out of evangelical Christianity, in my naivety, I used to walk in with believers thinking, wow, look at all this information I've discovered. I've got a list of data points, and all I must do is show them what I have exposing the problems in the Bible and with doctrine and all this, and they will see and they will be eager. They will want to know the information that I have uncovered, and we will all frolic together into Reasonville, and we will all leave superstition. And that just never happened, right? It never happened. And in fact, they were doubly convinced that they were right and I was going to help. And I was so frustrated because I was approaching it wrong, right? They weren't believing it for reasons of data. This was a connection, a heart connection to something linked to who they were as human beings. So my tactic has changed. The first thing I do is I develop a relationship with them personally before we ever talk about life, the universe, and everything. It's like if I know somebody on my tennis team who's a devout churchgoer. I don't walk up and say, hi, I'm Seth. I don't believe in any God anywhere. How are you? I walk up and we talk about light stuff. We have a cup of coffee. We go hit the ball for a while. We may go have dinner at some point. We just get to know each other in 3 dimensions. Once those social circles are there, then the walls begin to break down. It's harder to put me in a box. I'm not a cliche. I'm not a stereotype. Wait, Seth's an atheist? They'll find out. Seth doesn't believe in my faith, but he's such a nice guy. Now we're at a point where they aren't feeling attacked, where they've humanized me. And then I tend to lead with questions, not attacking questions, but the Socratic method. Well, how did you get there? Well, where did you learn that? Well, how do you come to that understanding? If I had a question, how would you approach that? Keeping them in a place where they don't feel attacked, because I remain convinced minds are changed from a position of safety. We will not change someone's mind if they feel unsafe. We have to let them know, no, it's okay. I'm not here to attack you. I may challenge you, but this is a safe space.
I want to follow on that point, Seth. That approach is the one I would prefer, but it might be the most humanistic tool to use in the toolbox, but it's one of many tools that should be used. And one thing I did want to bring up was the idea of mockery. It's not my go-to tool, and I would prefer to keep that one as a last resort or something to use very, very sparingly. Like, that's not something I think anyone should use outright, but I do think it has its place. And I think it's effective in showing how nuts, immoral, or harmful certain scriptures are, but it can also, as you say, just really alienate someone who might not be as familiar with the aspects of a religion that they thought they were. So it's something that has to be used carefully.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to that because you bring up a great point.
Yeah.
On the macro level, on the larger stage, when I'm not talking in the one-on-ones, I think ridicule and mockery is critical, right? How can you not ridicule the ridiculous? And I do it for a few reasons. One, I think the sacred cows need to be roasted. If somebody tells me this is off limits, Christ is off limits, Allah, Muhammad, that's off limits, you're not allowed, that's the first thing I go after, right? Congratulations, that is now number 1 on my list. And I think there is empowerment. It's a liberation exercise to take the things that used to control us and knock them way down and make fun of them and say you have no power. I absolutely agree with that. I also think it's healthy for other people to see us do that. Lightning doesn't strike, right? I'm not a miserable, horrible human being. I am able to just simply say, this is crap, and I'm going to have fun with the thing that used to bother or control me, or the thing I used to be afraid of. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm not afraid to make fun of this because I have defanged it. It has no power over me. And you're right, mockery does have an important part to play. I usually don't use it in the one-on-ones. It's usually a larger macro kind of thing for me. I don't know, Aleem, did you want to speak to mockery at all?
Sure.
I also, I mean, before you
Yes.
answer that, I also want to ask another question that very much goes with that.
Hang on, Gada. Like, I want to. There's more on this. I actually want to bring up. Can you just wait for a minute? Okay, thanks. Aleem, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, well, because Islam is like Muslims are particularly vulnerable, or that they take offense to any sort of mockery, especially when it comes to the Prophet Muhammad. This is something I personally struggle with because I talk to a lot of Muslims. A lot of Muslims talk to me, and I adopt a bit more of an non-offensive approach. I try not to use any of the commonly used insults or jokes that a lot of ex-Muslims use in social media. And the reason why is because I can think of so many examples where a Muslim has told me, well, I'll never listen to, let's say, Seth over here because he said this about the Prophet Muhammad. And it, as ridiculous as that can be, it's incredible to me that one thing, let's say Seth said, one joke he made at some point 5 years ago in some video, that immediately nullifies everything that he ever said, even if they're completely valid. And what does that mean? Does that mean that we just try to not say anything that might offend a religious person? No. So there needs to be some sort of balance, and it's a difficult one to figure out because you don't want to just cater to their every whim.
That's where I struggle a little bit because I haven't figured that out for myself in my personal life. Like, I think Seth makes a great point here about, like, one approach is better for one-on-one conversations. The softer one-on-one is probably better for a more public dialogue, so to speak. But like, the next question I have is for the both of you, and where do we find this balance? And I want to ask the question this way because in my own personal life, I'm a Star Trek fanatic, and I believe Seth is a Star Trek fan himself. This question,
Look at God.
I want to ask this.
Oh,
Seth.
God.
Seth, being a Star Trek fan, when do you decide to set your phasers from stun to vaporize?
Well, usually if they say they like the Star Wars prequels, then I think to absolutely decimate them. Anybody who says that, I've given up all hope on them, so no. But, it's funny, when I was growing up, my parents were a little bit distrustful of kind of the humanistic messages that used to come out of Trek, and still do. And now it's funny looking back and hearing the story about the origin of the entire franchise and seeing it with new eyes. It's really a beautiful thing. And I think it's this whole notion that human beings need to be here to solve our own problems because we don't see help coming from above. I mean, that's a beautiful message that I think we are seeing expressed in both fiction and in nonfiction media all around the world. So,
well, Gada, did you want to ask something? I'm sorry for interrupting. Go ahead.
My question was mainly related to what Aleem was talking about before, when he was talking about how the Israel and Palestinians were getting together, and it was mainly also related to how you're talking to between believers and non-believers. So, I mean, I know when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, and it's extremely emotional, it's extremely opinionated. So, have you seen or been to any of those, believers, non-believers meetings, or from your speaking, from your information, like from your activism, when you were talking to, Muslims or religious people, and talking to them and giving them that kind of more respectful approach, did you still find that offense? And I'm going to give you just an example of, like, from my perspective. I never, and I do the same thing that you do. If somebody from my family or somebody that is Muslim especially talks to me, I don't insult, I don't bring anything else. I try my best to bring it to we are here, we agree to disagree. I mean, you want this religion, I don't think it's my religion. Mm-hmm. But from your perspective, especially with how almost everything you say in Islam, like as a criticism, is considered immediately an attack. How do you go around that? How do you lessen the blow? If you can speak from your experience about that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, the best way to explain it is, let's say you're walking down the street and a Jehovah's Witness tries to convert you. You're immediately going to kind of be like, oh, like you're going to be skittish, and you're not going to really want to listen to what they say, and you're going to try and escape, basically. Uh, and the reverse is true. If you go in, if I was to go in talking to a Muslim with the intention, I want to deconvert you, and I'm going to show you how all your beliefs are wrong and harmful, and because I want you to be an atheist like me, they're going to sense that, because it's going to impact the entire interaction. So, kind of going off what Seth was saying earlier, I basically do the same thing, where I don't go in with the intention of, you know what, I want you to stop being Muslim right now. I just ask questions. I share my story because they want to understand where I'm coming from. I go into detail explaining of why I left and what my issues were. And that's where the dialogue really begins. And my objective, my intention isn't to get them to stop believing. My intention is to ask them questions they haven't asked themselves before. Get them to look at things from a new perspective, a different kind of perspective that they probably didn't have. And I know this because I didn't have it when I was a believer. And then the ball's in their court. They can decide what they want to do with it. They can do nothing with it. And what I can tell you is, I've done this in person a little bit, but for the most part, it's a lot of DMing on Instagram, on Twitter, Instagram calling. What ends up happening is a lot of these Muslims will come back. And I think it's because a lot of them sense that there's something amiss. There's something they're uncomfortable with. There's something they're wrestling with. And I become then someone safe that they can explore this stuff with. Maybe they end up leaving Islam in 5 years, 10 years time. I don't know. But if you just go in with that little step of asking the questions, I think that's better than, the frontal assault.
Putting those two ideas together, my all-time favorite, hands down, religious debater is Matt Dillahunty. I used to watch the Atheist.
I have something to say about him. I'll let you speak.
I used to watch the Atheist Experience religiously, and Matt has just this incredibly debating style. And the kind of example I give whenever he debates is that he latches on like a rabid dog onto intellectually dishonest points and does not let go of the interlocutor's arm until he or she acknowledges something that he or she may have brought up that's intellectually dishonest. And the more and more someone decides to latch on to whatever it is they want to protect, the more awkward they look. But I'm also a fan of Anthony Magnabosco's street epistemology, and the kind of Socratic.
Me too, big fan. Yeah.
Yes, the methods he uses. When you see the conversations he has with people, it rarely, if ever, is antagonistic. I used to go on his channel all the time and just watch video after video. You can see the gears turning in their head about he's really, you can actually see he's making them think in real time, and he's forcing someone to really explore their positions. Do they have any foundations for their beliefs? Now we see two different methodologies with their pros and cons, and I think Matt's method is generally better for speaking to crowds, but Anthony's is better for one-on-one. But again, that's just a very simplistic assertion on my part. What's your take on each individual style of persuasion? Like, what do you consider the pros and cons, and how would you use those in your own lives, in your interactions with religion or ideology?
So Seth, I'm just going to say something a little bit about Matt, and then I'll pass it on to you.
No.
So Matt Dillahunty, the Atheist Experience, is something I've been watching for, I don't even know how long, 12 years, maybe even longer. And I've always had this internal debate, and I've talked about it with friends who are also fans of his channel, about, is his approach really the best one? Because for all the times I can think of where he really swayed someone, I can think of interactions where he's just literally saying, shut up, shut up, shut up, over and over again, or just muting people whenever he feels like it, or just calls them idiots, where he just literally says, idiot, I'm still talking. And to me, just like by my nature, I feel like that can't be a good way to, if your goal is to, share understanding and, build connection with people to get them thinking. I don't think that's the best way. And I think in his case, he's just been doing it for too goddamn long. And he's probably just super burnt out. But, and this is a point my friend made, and then I'll pass on to you, Seth, is that approach is really dynamic and really attracts a lot of people. It's confrontational, and people like confrontation. They like seeing conflict, and his reach is incredibly massive. So, and he reaches a lot of people with his good arguments in between, all the, just yelling and stuff. So it's again one of those things where you got to take the good with the bad, I suppose, with Matt Dillahunty's approach. I wouldn't personally do it, but I think it definitely has a place within the community.
I like his
I-
approach, though.
well,
Aleem,
When I've co-hosted with Matt, you can see that our styles are dramatically different, where we approach callers differently, and we have we have a different frequency that we operate on when dealing with people. So I totally get that. With the atheist experience and call-in shows like that, I tend to suspect that dissecting the bad argument of the caller, even in an overt and very direct way, is not as much about the caller as about the people watching from
That's a good
their
point.
own, from a position of safety, because they don't feel like they're being attacked, but they're watching a belief that they may hold in this safe space. They're watching that belief just dismantled. And I think that may be the reason that some of these, really hot one-on-ones go, and he doesn't let go with a particular bad argument, and he's just going to work it to death. And do I agree with the approach always? No, of course not. Do I think sometimes I'd like to lower the volume, de-escalate a little bit? Sometimes
Yeah.
I'd like to give people a little more rope, right? I mean, let them finish whatever the point was, even if it's a multi-point point. Let's get it out there. But I think that's just a style thing. But I understand what you're talking about. You're not going to browbeat or berate someone into saying, you know what, maybe I am an idiot. I will now reverse everything that I once believed and held dear, and I will be a completely different person. It just doesn't happen that way.
I have a question that is, it literally came to mind after I finished reading after finishing reading Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky. And if people don't know what Rules for Radicals is, it's essentially a very leftist book written by Saul Alinsky, who helped organize a lot of leftist movements, including the civil rights movement, the war, protesting against the war in Vietnam. It was written in the 60s, 70s. So he talks a lot about essentially, he talks about, how you can make your point, either demonizing the other person, but the one thing that he kept on mentioning is not necessarily that the ends justify the means, but this end that I am thinking of justifies this particular mean. And from what I've seen in a lot of these, atheist channels like Matt Dillahunty and others, is that they use that in like trying to disrupt the other person. What do you think about that kind of strategy in the atheist communities, in the humanist communities, and should we use that kind of radicalized rules that Mr. Alinsky talks about, for example, in his book, things that may not necessarily be, morally black and white, but it's more on the gray side?
I have one point to say about this. I think there's a lot of people in the space, and I'll talk about the ex-Muslim space specifically, who are doing that already. And I think what we need more of is shifting away from criticism and confrontation to talking about the things that we hold in common, our heritage, our background, the positive things that we know can come out of religion, and just present people with an alternative. And one of the things I do a lot is just share how I kind of rebuilt my life philosophy and how I found my life values without Islam. Because a question I often get from Muslims is, what do you believe in now? Like, how do you know what's right from wrong? Why are you alive? Why aren't you just going? Literally, the question I get asked sometimes is, why aren't you going around just killing people and stealing? And yeah, so but if you've been a Muslim your whole life, it's understandable that you would ask that question because it's the framework for your life. And I feel like instead of directly confronting people with the things that are bad that they're doing or the bad things that they're believing, if we focus on giving them another alternative that maybe they haven't considered or thought of before, a way of life outside of it, it gets them thinking.
One question I do want to bring to each of you gentlemen, but before I do, I just want to put a reminder for our listeners. Please go to the Faithless Hijabi website to make donations for Faithless Hijabi's mental health program. The link should be down below in the footnote for this for the stream. When we debate and speak to people about religion, part of what I hope gets across is the idea that we want to live in a more rational world. We want to live in a world that's grounded in reality, and we want people to practice critical thinking. But that's a term that I hear thrown out from people from all over. I hear from people across the political spectrum. I hear it from religious people. I hear it from just about everybody. But I've never heard a good definition of what that actually means. So, I kind of whipped up my own that seems to vibe with whatever I've learned from my studies of the Enlightenment period. And how I define it is that you're asserting a conclusion on phenomena directed by and caged in by the best material evidence there is at the time. And most people I speak to would philosophers or scientists seem to agree that this is a relatively good definition. This one I run by people when I try to describe what critical thinking means. But I'm not an expert. You two have been in this space a lot longer than I have. What does critical thinking mean to you, and what process of thought do you try to get across to people, not just in terms of debating dogma, but how would you like to have someone think?
All right, Aleem, I'm going to jump in on this. and I've got an agenda, because I'm going to leapfrog off of Bruce's question into a larger point that I think is really salient. By the way, I would encourage anybody who's in the Thinking Atheist audience to donate to Faithless Hijabi's mental health program for ex-Muslims. The plight of ex-Muslims, apostates, people coming out of fundy cultures and going through immense consequences. They need all the help we can give them. And if we can't be there in person, or we can't provide the infrastructure, the donations to an organization that can do that, is doing that, toss them a few bucks. Well, conspiracy theorists think that they are critical thinkers, right? The 9/11 truthers. I saw engineers for 9/11 truth, and they believe that the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were all part of an inside job, and jet fuel can't melt steel beams, and Building 7 and the vertical drop, and they've got all of this stuff, right? Well, these aren't stupid people, and they had simply connected dots that were never meant to be connected, but they believe, I'm onto it. I've looked at the evidence, and I am thinking. I wish everybody else was thinking as critically as I am, because I was able to figure out that it was all a conspiracy. But no. Yeah. So that's a real challenge. Like COVID vaccination science, everybody's like, well, I've done the research, and now they genuinely believe that by going to YouTube University or alexjones.freedom.eagle.com to get their information, they've done the due diligence. And that's tough. I mean, that's going to be tough to overcome. But there's a larger point that I think is, and we're losing this in the age of the internet. Good people can hold terrible ideas. And what I'm seeing alarmingly is I was a white Christian nationalist, right? I was pro-death penalty. I was a gun nut, NRA type. I was an LGBTQ bigot, right? I thought the gays were all going to hell, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I was a lot of terrible things. But I was also a victim of brainwashing by a fundy religious culture, and someone who genuinely did believe he was doing the right thing and was trying to live a moral life. I'd just been programmed. And I needed the opportunity to become deprogrammed, to be introduced to the people I'd been bigoted against, to be introduced to better ideas, to see the greater world. And I so often, especially in the age of online quote unquote discourse, we see someone who's got a bad idea and we nuke them from orbit. They are not human. They are now dead to us. I block you. I'm not going to engage you. I'm going to call you every name in the book. I just don't think that's how we change the world. And already people hearing me say that are like, oh, yeah, well, I'm not going to be friends with Nazis. And I'm like, did I say anything about Nazis? Am I talking about that? Everybody does that. They just swing right over here to this extreme case. There are a lot of everyday people who are good people who simply have bad ideas. Why do they have them? How did they get there? What informs that bad idea? Can that bad idea be changed or eliminated or improved? Are they genuinely interested in truth? Can we get them there? Can we be human beings first and find a way to get them there? And man, that's a part of the conversation I sure would like to see happen. Instead of, oh yeah, I'm going to flame you on Twitter and then I'm going to screenshot all the stuff you've said that I think is stupid. I'm going to call you names, then block you. That's not how we change the world. I'm convinced of it. Sorry, I went off on a diatribe. This is what happens when you ask me a question. I'm sorry. I'm done.
I love it. Aleem,
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, couldn't agree more. There's maybe one thing I can just say to piggyback on what Seth said. To me, when it comes to critical thinking, and this is something that I personally practice, is I follow the process when I'm looking at evidence, arguments, ideas, to where they lead. Even if they lead to places that might be uncomfortable, that I don't want it to lead to. And if I was to say in one nutshell, what is the difference between me and many people who are still believers, is I opened myself up to the possibility to let go of the assumption that Islam was true. So when I started looking at Islam again, I didn't look at it, well, of course Islam is true, and everything that I learn and find is going to lead me to this eventual, conclusion. Because that's not critical thinking. That's you using anything you can to just, support the belief that you want to have. And once I let that go and I followed that process, it was scary because I had to let go of a lot of things. I had to let go of, will I see my family? Will I see my parents after they die? Will I continue to exist after I die? When something horrible happens to me, did it happen for a reason, or what did it just happen? So Islam comforted me with a lot of those things, and those comforts were the basis of, if you want to call it, my critical thinking when I was still Muslim. But when I was finally able to honestly, critically examine my religion, I had to let those things go, because there was just no basis for them that I could convince myself it was true anymore. And if people are willing and brave enough to do that, I think the world would be a much different and arguably better place.
I was talking to David McRaney. He's the author of the book How Minds Change. And he was telling the story about a 9/11 truther, somebody who believed it was all, bogus and it was staged and the victims were all crisis actors and it was all just a big plot. And instead of flaming him, with all the insults in the book, they actually connected with him. And they brought him and introduced him to the families of those who had died in the attacks, and showed him and introduced him to scientists who were able to show him how the evidence all played in, blah, 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 and the logistics. And he spent time being introduced to the humanity. And instead of throwing rocks at them from afar, he really saw the whole thing as kind of humanized. And then he went back and reversed his position and said, I was wrong. Like I now know that I was wrong. And his 9/11 truther tribe just turned on him and vilified him and called him every name in the book and did horrible things. And Aleem speaks to something about comfort that I think we as seculars need to deal with. We are asking people not as much to give up the Quran or the Bible, because I don't think most people believe or call themselves a Muslim or Christian because of the Quran or the Bible. This is a community. This is a sense of tribe and belonging. Humans are tribal, right? So it's not, hey, I think this is factually wrong. It's, you may lose your friends, you may lose your support system, Your spouse may leave you. Your parents may ostracize you. You may lose custody of your children. Your boss may fire you. You may be in fear for your life. There's so many other things going on. So we need to begin to weave a better net for the apostate to fall into, right? Because we'll go and say, well, it's factually wrong, but there's no belonging over here. We don't have the infrastructure because we think only sheep have community, because communities are always church. We have all these excuses. I just think that's crazy. We have to give them a safe landing zone so that they can feel more inclined to sort of lean outside of fundamentalism and know that, well, maybe if I do have some losses, I will have other gains over here that make it worth it.
I'd like to close out this session by asking one final question. Given the nature of critical thinking and given how people react when they're attacked, in the age of social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and how nasty it can get, how social media gives everyone an avenue to be nasty under the rather cowardly cloak of anonymity. Has it helped or harmed the dialogue between the believer, the true believer, and someone who's more skeptical? We see examples of how it helps. I believe there was a young lady who was escaping Saudi Arabia, and she used Twitter to her advantage, letting everyone know that I think her name was Rahaf Mohammed, and she let people know there are people there who are going to take her back to Saudi Arabia. And I've read her story. Like, they probably would have done horrific things to her, and like horrific things have already happened to her. And heaven only knows what would have happened if they brought her back. So that's one of the positives. But given the kind of nastiness we see on there, has it helped the dialogue with religion at all?
I have one thing to say about this, just from my own personal experience. So when I first embarked on this whole journey, what actually started me off was I wrote a book. So I wrote a book about my personal experiences with Islam, why I left, and what I replaced it with in my life. I tried to get it published. Did not have much success or much interest from publishers because Islam is a very sensitive subject, especially if you're criticizing it in Canada. So I decided to go to social media. And even though I don't have the biggest following, I know for a fact that the things I've written, the things I've shared have reached, like no exaggeration, tens of thousands of people. And for as much as there is all this nastiness on social media, you have the space to share your feelings, to express what you went through. And there are people out there who connect with it and who resonate with it, who wouldn't have found you otherwise. So I think the nastiness is a byproduct of that. I think there's a lot of fear from a lot of believers when they see, a big ex-Muslim website or account with a big following, and they want to attack it. They want to dismantle it because they're threatened by it. So in that sense, it's kind of inevitable because I think there is a lot of good that's still coming from it.
I think there's so many layers to this onion. You'd mentioned was it Raha Muhammad?
Rahaf, yeah.
What a great example of the internet. It's almost like the Iranian Revolution. There's so much that we would never know about this uprising after the murder of Mahsa Amini. But the internet and social media has allowed this footage, these protests, the news to leak out. And I think
precisely
that's huge. I think I use it every day. I try to share information. It's a beautiful tool for sharing content. I try to set a certain tone. It engages people. But I'll tell you, it's affected me. And I have had to budget my time online because, and I did a show with the title, Twitter is not life. Like Twitter, we interact with people so much differently in 240 characters, mashing away at a keyboard, knee-jerking something online than I ever would if we were sitting across from each other in a living room or in at a restaurant or something. I worry about the dehumanizing aspect, the reductive aspect. People are binary. especially on the internet. It's someone's always all right and the other person's always all wrong, and everybody then chooses sides, and it's mobs and it's craziness. And I'm like, well, people are messy, situations are messy, and sometimes these conversations require nuance. You're not going to get that on Twitter. You don't get the eye contact, the tenor of the voice, the expression, the hands, the humanity. All of that is absent. And so it's funny, not forgive the long answer, but I've really been working on me. I sound like a self-help thing. I've really been working on me so that I will be better as a human being. Okay, but here's an example. So somebody came on my page and they said something, and I snarked, right? I just snarked immediately right back because that was the easy thing. Bam. And they came back and they said, well, I disagree about this. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm a big fan. I've listened a long time, and I'm sorry. This has been our first encounter. And I'm sorry it was like this. And I felt all of a sudden very self-conscious that I had made it worse. I had a point, and it was a good point, but my approach was terrible. And so then I thought, all right, I'm going to tactically de-escalate. And I went back and I said, you're right. I could have handled this better. Please understand, this is what I was trying to say, but I totally understand your approach. And they said, it's okay. I really get your point, and I understand your frustration. I'm like, okay, well, just know it came from a good place and you're greatly appreciated. So instead of us flaming each other online, using specific language, knowing how social media operations exist, we were able to sort of step back down to a point of reconciliation and connection. And that's going to take, it's work. It just takes work. And I don't think a lot of people want to put in the work. But I certainly hope we can find that within ourselves to start with. Can this be de-escalated? Am I being fair? Is there a way to communicate nuance even in this format instead of just blasting ourselves onto somebody else's feed or in their comment section? It's going to be a real challenge moving forward.
I'm largely under the opinion that the world would be a better place if Twitter had burned down tomorrow. We would never miss it. But then again, we're missing out on what a good it's done. And a discussion with an old friend recently let me know that Twitter is as good or as bad as you decide to use it, and what kind of values do you bring to the table when you decide to use a platform of that kind of magnitude.
Yeah.
But then go ahead. Got it.
Yeah, I just want to say, in addition to that, Twitter, even though we think now because everything's online, Twitter really is not real life. Yeah. The majority of people don't talk like that. No, people don't just, the real answer to something is not going to be somebody being like cooked or based or Nazi. Maybe, but it's not going to be the thing that really happens. Anyway, I think this is a good place to end, because Seth, that was a very wonderful play.
Well, and if I can tack on one last thing, if I could preach any sermon as an atheist to anybody online, stop feeding the trolls.
Please,
there are people,
yes.
There are people who throw this stuff out, right? They throw out the inflammatory and the nasty and the escalatory. They are aching for our attention. They're aching for our oxygen. They want us to stop whatever we're doing and target them and engage them. They're not operating in good faith. They want to ride our coattails into some kind of a spotlight. And I think the best revenge is to just blink and move on with your day. Deny them your time, your energy, your focus, your oxygen. If they're operating in bad faith, so what? Move on. I'd love to see more of that. I'm sorry, Gada. Go ahead.
No, thank you so much. Thank you, Seth. Thank you, Aleem. That was a wonderful talk. And I just wanted to let everybody know, please donate to the Faithless Hijabi Mental Health Program. It's a good program. We've helped a lot of people all over the world. There are so many ex-Muslims and those that are questioning, that are all over the world in Muslim majority countries that don't really have access to what mental health programs that we have over in the West, or just in general, where they can have these conversations with somebody that they can trust. So please go ahead and donate to Faithless Hijabi Mental Health Program. It's doing great work. I really love this program. If I knew that there was a mental health program back in 10 years ago when I first decided, it would have been great. I had to go through several therapists until I found somebody that wasn't going to be like re-traumatizing to me, because I had to like essentially tell everything from start to finish in order for them to understand. We have mental health specialists that are trained for ex-Muslims, and it's a great program. Please go ahead and click on the donation link and donate. Thank you, Seth. Thank you, Aleem.
Thank you both.
Thank you
An
to
honor.
both of you
Thank
too.
you very much.
That was one of the best talks I've had with people when doing podcasting or whatever. It's like I've followed Seth Andrews for quite some time. I listened to one of his talks in person literally a few months before COVID hit, I think. And several very important salient points raised and interesting to listen to.